Putin's regime, like the Soviet Union before it, his system is always on the brink of collapse. By Maksim Samorukov-Through many appearances on the outside, Russian President Vladimir Putin's grip on power is stronger than ever. The country has recovered from initial military setbacks in Ukraine and the initial shock from Western sanctions. State oil is flowing to new markets in Asia, including China, India, and Turkey, and the country's defense sector is producing more weapons than all of Europe. Domestically, Putin has crushed what remained of political opposition on both the right and left, after removing mercenary leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, whose uprising against Moscow failed last summer, and popular opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who died in a Siberian prison in February and then won an unprecedented fifth term in a presidential election elaborately staged in March. Meanwhile, Russian society, buoyed by a 16% increase in public spending, has adapted to Moscow's self-styled, existential confrontation with the West, which the Kremlin is prepared to pursue to the bitter end. Bitter. But Putin's Russia is vulnerable, and its vulnerabilities are hidden in plain sight. More than ever, the Kremlin makes decisions in an individualized and arbitrary manner, lacking even basic quality control. Since Moscow launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia's political elite has become more pliable in carrying out Putin's orders and more obtuse in pandering to a paranoid worldview. The costs of these structural deficiencies are increasing. But even a horrific terrorist attack by the Islamic State, or ISIS-K, at a concert hall on the outskirts of Moscow on March 22, killing 145 civilians, did not make the Russian leadership reconsider your priorities. Putin's regime, a highly personalized system run by an aging dictator, is more fragile than it appears. Driven by Putin's whims and delusions, Moscow can make self-defeating mistakes. The Russian state effectively carries out orders from the highest levels, but it has no control over the quality of those orders. For that reason, it risks collapsing forever overnight, as its Soviet predecessor did 3 decades ago. The trap of automatic regime. Princeton University historian Stephen Kotkin once noted that the West did not foresee the collapse of the Soviet Union because the country simply did not collapse. There is no long-term trend that makes the dissolution of the Soviet Union inevitable. Instead, a relatively stable state was overthrown by a series of decisions made at the highest levels and implemented uncritically by a system without checks and balances. Although the comparison may at first seem unlikely, Putin's situation today resembles in some ways what Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev faced during the final years of the Soviet Union. In the late 1980s, Gorbachev instructed conservative apparatchiks to promote political and economic liberalization. Accustomed to blindly carrying out orders from above, officials offered little resistance. Putin does not have Gorbachev's ideal humanism, but he resembles Gorbachev in one important respect: the ability to impose his personal vision on the Russian state. Putin used his concentrated power to throw Russia into a brutal war with Ukraine. The Russian state bureaucracy devotes more and more resources to predicting and implementing the president's wishes. Some consequences of this increasingly autocratic system are obvious. Putin has eroded political freedom, impoverished the media landscape and forced many talented Russians into exile. Other effects are less obvious. Russian security agencies have spent decades fighting Islamic extremism both domestically in the North Caucasus and abroad in Syria. But Putin's war in Ukraine has made the institutional knowledge of the security forces obsolete, and they now reject information shared by Western intelligence agencies. 2 weeks before the attack at Crocus City Hall, the United States identified the concert venue as a possible terrorist target. Mr. Putin described the U.S. warnings as attempts to threaten and destabilize our society. Putin's regime, a highly personalized system run by an aging dictator, is more fragile than it appears. Investigating and arresting violent religious extremists is no longer a top priority, as the president diverts state resources to dream up conspiratorial links between terrorist actions and Kiev. Even a major terrorist attack near the capital failed to provide a wake-up call. By instructing officials to try to establish the Ukraine's involvement in the Arena massacre, Putin is effectively obstructing the investigation and distracting from measures to prevent such attacks in the future. Similarly, Russia's economic ministries have stopped coordinating with each other. Instead, they focused on generating numbers that would please Putin. Central bank efforts to rein in inflation with high interest rates coupled with state-subsidized loans increased domestic demand. The government imposed export embargoes on Russian oil products, cancelled them and then reimposed them, as part of a turf war between the Energy Ministry, which sought to reduce domestic prices, and the Ministry of Finance want higher revenue. Officials managing the economy have implemented what amounts to permanent temporary administrative fixes to avoid practical solutions that could displease the president. Russia's economic policy makers have won international acclaim for keeping the country's economy afloat amid unprecedented Western sanctions, but they are increasingly criticized. Hampered by the Kremlin's authoritarian regime, and it is unclear how much longer the current stability can be maintained. These technocrats could also be eliminated altogether if Putin decides the war effort requires tighter control. Indecision is tiring. Putin's indecisiveness tends to be as destructive as the actual decisions he makes, and here the similarities with the late Soviet Union are especially striking. By the end of 1989, Gorbachev had become so confused by the significance of the changes he had introduced that he tried to block the reforms, causing the state apparatus to lose a coherent vision and confused in not knowing how to proceed. Without top-level guidance, the Soviet system drifted for a time, before collapsing. Modern Russia faces a similar problem. After starting a full-scale war, Putin rarely bothered to explain to state and quasi-state actors how to adapt to the new reality. In the absence of guidance, they either fall into a state of shock or take matters into their own hands, sometimes with disastrous consequences. The mutiny of mercenary leader Prigozhin is a case in point. For years, Prigozhin's Wagner Company, a private militia funded by the Kremlin, had an uneasy coexistence with the defense ministry, but as the war became increasingly bogged down in the east in late spring 2023, their mutual hostility has reached its peak. When Putin refused to arbitrate between them, Prigozhin launched an uprising, sending thousands of heavily armed mercenaries to the outskirts of Moscow. Russia's bloated security apparatus did not resist. Putin intervened at the 11th hour, brokering a negotiated end to the crisis and then, almost certainly, ordering the shooting down of Prigozhin's private plane, leading to his death. The crisis has exposed the astonishing impotence of the seemingly powerful Russian state without its leader's instructions. It also pushed the country to the brink of a civil war between government forces and the mercenary army of a private warlord. 2 months later, Putin's failure to rein in extremism set the stage for a massacre in the predominantly Muslim region of Dagestan, southern Russia, when a mob stormed an airport to search for Jews from Tel Aviv. Such rioting would have been unthinkable before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but Russia has increased cooperation with Iran since the war began, and Iranian-influenced anti-Semitism has crept into Moscow's anti-Western rhetoric. Local authorities do not know whether they should support or suppress these anti-Israel activists. Ultimately, it required direct intervention from Moscow to disperse the crowd. The terrible human cost of the ISIS-K attack outside Moscow was also the result of ambiguous and contradictory signals from the Kremlin. On the one hand, Russian intelligence agencies are tasked with fighting terrorism. On the other hand, they have a long institutionalized practice of regarding information coming from Western powers with suspicion. The March 22 attack likely would not have killed many people and could have been prevented altogether, had Russia maintained functional intelligence sharing channels with the West. Instead, Putin dismissed the American warnings, calling them blackmail, and Russian intelligence agencies refused to take seriously the audio information they presented. Putin's House of Cards. Putin's inflexibility and stubbornness have been reinforced by his years of being surrounded by toads and yes-men. Protected from negative feedback and objective advice, he is easily influenced by visions tunnels, jumbled priorities and emotional outbursts all feed into his decisions. As a result, Russia's foreign policy, internal security, and economic prospects are all affected. Many dictators are haunted by their personal history and legacy, and Putin is no exception. He has been in power longer than any Russian leader since Stalin. At 71, he is also approaching the point at which most of his 20th century predecessors died. His awareness of his own mortality certainly influenced his decision-making. His growing sense of time constraints certainly contributed to the fateful decision to invade Ukraine in 2022. It could also manifest in even bigger mistakes. On the surface, Putin's regime appears stable. The docility of elites, the persistence of vast financial reserves and oil rents, and the state's adeptness at shaping public opinion all make Putin seem invincible. But his system did not collapse, in the same way that the late Soviet Union did not collapse. And as with the Soviet Union, the structure of Putin's regime makes it much more fragile than it appears. Consider that, just a year ago, Almost no one would have imagined Prigozhin's mercenaries marching hundreds of miles toward Moscow and encountering virtually no resistance along the way, or a horde and anti-Semitic mob stormed a Russian international airport. Similar unpredictability is likely to mark the Russian regime's future crises. Even a small incident, whether a setback in Ukraine, elite infighting, or renewed domestic unrest, could trigger a political avalanche if accelerated by inaction. Government actions or policies based on Putin's delusions. It is not the severity of Russia's problems but the Kremlin's response to them that has put the regime permanently on the brink of collapse. A collapse could take years to materialize. Or it could happen in a matter of weeks. But the West should be aware that at any moment, events in Russia could spiral out of the Kremlin's control, causing the swift collapse of its seemingly eternal regime.